And to this day, they have, the majority of their grid is based off nuclear energy, and they also pay a lot less for their electricity than we do.
That's what happens when you let Extinction Rebellion set the agenda here. The reason why I've unfollowed most conservative politicians on Twitter is that when every time you saw them tweeting something, it was about them moaning about the blob doing this or wokery, this and that, acting as if they were the opposition to some sections of the more conspiratorial left. It is what the World Economic Forum is to the conspiratorial sections of the cranked right.
Hello and welcome to the Institute of Economic Affairs podcast. My name's Tom Clougherty. I'm the Executive Director here at the IEA, and I'm joined on the podcast this week by two members of the IEA's research team, Kristian Niemietz, our Editorial Director and Head of Political Economy, and Daniel Freeman, our Managing Editor. Reem Ibrahim will be back in a couple of weeks. Our goal, as ever, is to bring you a current affairs podcast with a difference. We want to get beyond the headlines and shallow political commentary you may hear elsewhere, and instead focus on the big ideas and foundational principles that matter to classical liberals. This week, we're going to be talking about Kristian's recent visit to the Mont Pelerin Society meeting in New Delhi, about my experience at the Conservative Party conference, and in particular, a very interesting pamphlet that the Kemi Badenoch campaign put out midweek. But first, we're going to talk about the closure of Britain's last coal-fired power station and what that means for our politics, our economics, and our growth prospects going forward. Daniel.
Yeah, so this week is a fairly historically significant week in terms of how Britain has got its electricity. So since the 1880s, one of our key sources of generating electricity has been coal power. In as late as the early 1990s, coal accounted for about 80% of all our electricity generation. But now, as you said, the last coal-fired power station at Ratcliffe-on-Soar has been shut down. And this was following through on a promise that Amber Rudd made back in 2015 that the UK electricity grid would be completely coal-free by October 2024. That seemed like quite a long way away in 2015, but now we're here and it's happened.
Mission accomplished.
Yes. Well, in one sense, yes, Britain has transitioned away from coal, and there are some advantages to that. Coal is probably it is the most carbon intensive way of generating electricity, and it also has other emissions that create various negative externalities. The slight problem is that we're not doing this in a context of replacing it with cheap, abundant alternatives. So since between 2001 and 2021, the amount of electricity we've actually been producing has fallen by over a third in per capita terms. And also electricity prices have increased a lot, which has put a lot of stress on energy-intensive industries in particular, such as the steel industry, which we've been hearing a lot about, as well as on households and household budgets.
Yeah, and I think this is the interesting thing, right, Kristian? You say mission accomplished, and in a sense, government set a mission, and they have indeed accomplished it right at the last minute, but nevertheless, target hit. I suppose my concern here is not that we're not burning coal, which has downsides, as you've put it very well there, but that we haven't really replaced it like for like. Coal surely played an incredible role in Britain's rise to wealth and power, and it literally fired the Industrial Revolution, right? There's an alternative history here, I think, that we can ponder, which is that Britain was basically the first mover on nuclear energy. We split the atom, we opened the first nuclear power station. This was decades and decades ago. We got there before anyone else. Now, had that nuclear energy industry developed the way that perhaps we would have anticipated it to develop. You might think that we would have got rid of coal much sooner, and that we would have replaced coal with something that was similarly abundant, inexpensive, reliable, and so on. Now, it's not clear necessarily that nuclear, as it's developed, meets those criteria. But it's also, I think, very unclear that the direction we're heading towards a very renewables-heavy grid, but which nonetheless requires a lot of backup baseload capacity, really is going to do the trick economically. And that seems like a big danger to me. I know there's this concept of the Henry Adams curve, I think it's called, where basically over the course of human history, or at least since industrialization, right, energy use per person grew steadily at about 2% a year. So this is a curve that gets steeper and steeper and steeper. And, you look at the US, energy usage tracked that curve as they developed extremely well until the oil shock of the 1970s. And then suddenly this relationship doesn't hold and the line wiggles up and down a bit, but it basically flatlines. And I know a lot of people think, if you take a broader view of kind of Western economies and growth and everything, this first sense of stagnation really started to kick in around that time. When we stopped using more energy per person year on year, when we shifted towards something which sounds very nice, towards more energy efficiency, towards trying to do more with less, or trying to do at least as much or as much as you can with less. But maybe nevertheless, this has hindered our ambitions. This has curbed our growth. And now that's a slightly different point, a more sweeping historical analysis. But are we doing something similar in Britain if we are just trying to... And I think this is quite unique among developed countries, that we are actually using less energy.
It's not fully unique. Quite a few other European countries have also seen their overall electricity usage decline. So I think France's electricity usage over the same period has declined by about 15%. Germany has also seen a decline, but pretty consistently, their decline has been slower than, and there are lots of countries where you haven't really seen a decline in electricity use. On your point about nuclear power, is the thing is we don't really have to do some sort of weird counterfactual history, because there was a country that did basically pursue this route, and it was France. France did go down the route of substituting coal for nuclear energy, engaged in a huge program, and to this day they have the majority of their grid is based off nuclear energy. And they also pay a lot less for their electricity than we do. Or, you also have, and an even more extreme example, you have the US, where until about 2004, 2005, Britain's industrial energy electricity prices basically tracked the US's prices. After about 2005, a gap starts to emerge, and it grows bigger and bigger and bigger, so that by 2019, British companies are paying about 2.5 times as much for electricity as US firms are. Now, in 2024, it's increased to 4 times. So in this context, it makes it extremely difficult for energy-intensive industries to compete in Britain against not even against Chinese or Indian firms, but against American firms, simply because energy and electricity is so much cheaper.
And this is also an area where I think our side of the argument has missed the trick for a while, because we've concentrated too much on the energy retail market. Because that's where most of the day-to-day political controversies arise, where every time something goes wrong, energy bills go up, there will be calls for nationalization. And we felt obliged to defend the legacy of privatization, or at least to explain this isn't where the problem lies. It's the green levies, it's wholesale prices. But what we should have done perhaps much earlier is talk about energy generation. If you don't have enough energy going into the market, it doesn't really matter how you organize the retail side of things. You can have, it would be like having the most efficient supermarket sector in the world, but if the government controls the supply of bread and beer that goes into the supermarkets, that doesn't get you very far. And this is also why it may, I guess some listeners will probably find it a bit puzzling that we as liberals, as free marketeers, refer to France here as a positive example. But I think there is no contradiction here. They may not have organized their energy retail market in a very liberal way, but they just generate energy. And that's true across a lot of areas where they are clearly not the kind of economy that we want, but they get some of the basics right. They build stuff, they generate stuff.
And this is, I think, the fundamental problem with the British economy currently. It's not really to do with taxes or sort of labour laws per se. It's to do with basically it's really expensive to use any energy or build anything anywhere.
Yeah.
And when you have those two fundamental problems, it's a massive constraint on any growth in any sector that relies on energy or a physical presence anywhere, which is pretty much all.
It's important to be clear on that point as well, because when we talk about energy-intensive industries, people are probably going to think of steel or heavy manufacturing, kind of dirty energy, dirty industries, the kind of things that people think, well, that's in Britain's industrial past. That's not the future that we're heading towards. But then you look at these stories, and there was one in the Financial Times this week about the enormous demand for energy from data centers, from big tech companies, particularly with the kind of processing power that AI requires, and which probably that's only going to get more significant as time goes by. Quite astonishing, actually, to read that Microsoft is reopening or commissioning the reopening of the 3 Mile Island nuclear power station in Pennsylvania in the US, which was the site of a famous, though not particularly damaging nuclear accident in the 80s, I think it was. And there was this story, as I say, in the Financial Times about how big tech companies are really looking to the nuclear industry, working out, can they locate their data centers next to existing power stations? People are talking about, are there new kind of funding models that you could have big tech investing, maybe putting equity into the new development of nuclear power stations and so on. So I think that's fascinating. I mean, the point, not to ramble off on a tangent there, though, is that I think it's a mistake to think that energy-intensive industry is in our past. Actually, an awful lot of what may drive technological advancement and productivity in the future also requires an awful lot of energy and a kind of stable baseload supply of abundant energy. Now, there's no contradiction, I think, with wanting that energy to be clean and trying to move towards decarbonisation. And there are more and less market-oriented ways you can do that, of course. But I think the idea that we can get by with less energy, which is more expensive and which is less reliable, this is kind of a fantasy. And it makes it all the more extraordinary, I think, that, when we put net zero into law, it was debated for 90 minutes in Parliament, and then immediately you were going for meetings with government ministers and special advisors afterwards, and they're saying, well, now, of course, everything we do as a government has to be seen through the lens of net zero. And we have these rolling 5-year carbon budgets, which have a huge economic impact. And I think the last one I read was debated for about 17 minutes in Parliament. Now, this is not to say that parliamentary debate is necessarily the way you get towards better policy, but it does suggest to me that we're just not really thinking about this stuff, that we're not taking it seriously enough as a country. And we're sort of wandering in a direction, maybe not entirely of our own choosing, which puts us at a significant disadvantage economically.
Yeah, but that's what happens when you let Extinction Rebellion set the agenda here. It's not this started in 2018, 19. Net zero suddenly seemed to come out of the blue, and governments just falling over, accepting that this was the zeitgeist, this had to be the direction of travel, even though what they should have done at the time was to say, well, we already have an ambitious decarbonization energy policy. It's not as if we're starting from doing nothing. We already had the Climate Change Act of 2008, and we are already on track to reduce carbon emissions, so true long before net zero was even a term that anyone used. And then this panic just broke out, and you had the Extinction Rebellion protests around here. I remember this. It was difficult to get to the office because they were blocking the whole of Westminster for about a year or so. And And I think it was the dying days of the Theresa May government where they just had this self-hatred, this perception we are on the wrong side of history, we are the baddies, and we have to make a concession to these people, and not thinking it through at all. What they should have said is simply, we're doing a lot already. However, decarbonization, important though it is not our only goal. We're going to balance this against competing objectives.
And I think, I mentioned more and less market-oriented ways of decarbonising. Probably the most market-oriented way you can decarbonise is just through manipulating the carbon price. So through something like a carbon tax, which maybe you border adjust as well to deal with some of those spillover and competitive effects. But ultimately, if you just say we're going to gradually raise the price of carbon to the point that it makes no economic sense for anybody to be emitting carbon, but we're not going to try and pick winners. We're not going to try and plan on a 5-year basis, our energy production. Then maybe you create freedom for entrepreneurs and technological advancement to kind of work towards that goal, but in a more organic or spontaneous Hayekian order kind of fashion. Now, you look like you're about to tell me it's a bit more complicated than that, but I'm not sure it has to be quite as complicated as we've made it for ourselves.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't disagree with that in outline in terms of how you incentivize people to how you incentivize people in industries to decarbonize overall. But in terms of electricity generation, particularly when it comes to nuclear, there do seem to be just a huge amount of regulatory barriers that have been created over the last 50, 60 years that basically make it extremely difficult for the private sector to actually do it at scale, in large part because the financing is so expensive. Because if you're saying, okay, we're EDF or whatever, and we want to build a new nuclear power station, getting permission for it, going through all the stages of planning may take 15 years. You'll have to deal with various transitions in governments who will, who knows if one of them is going to change its mind at the last minute, declare your, scupper the whole project, as actually happened in Australia. Sorry, not Australia, Austria. in the late 1970s, you got actually a nuclear power station that was fully complete, fully ready to go. There was a referendum, and by a narrow majority, it was voted never to turn it on. Wow. And so you get the Spanish government, or the German government recently, which in the German government's case, they have decided they're going to shut down all of their nuclear power industries, and the Spanish government is going to do the same. So you're kind of in a situation where, because of successive government decisions in Britain and around the world, it can be quite difficult for the private sector to actually go down this line because it's just too risky. And it might be the sort of situation where, the government does just have to spend some money, treat it as infrastructure, and be like, right, we're going to, pay South Korea to build a load of small modular reactors, and we're just going to treat that as a sort of investment in the long term.
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting point because, obviously it speaks to this theme of government intervention begetting more government intervention. And you maybe have a market which is so messed up that there's no way the private sector can function, and you need government to intervene. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that this would be a viable market. Maybe it would, maybe it wouldn't. It may be that there's just a kind of a public good argument here that cheap, clean, abundant energy would be underprovided by the market for various reasons, and there's a case for government to step in there. But just on this regulatory point around the nuclear industry, I suspect maybe there are two different things going on. So there's a much more widespread international phenomenon of overregulation. And I've heard this term, I think it's ALARA, as low as reasonably achievable.
Yeah.
And this
turns out to be very, very low.
Right. And so this is the idea that basically, most technologies, you expect them to become cheaper over time as people get the hang of the technology and they become more efficient. That hasn't really happened with nuclear because all of the efficiency gains have basically been recycled into reducing radiation. that escapes. And now that sounds like a good thing. Who could object to radiation being reduced? On the other hand, you started from a very low, very safe level. And you're just getting sort of safer and safer and safer to the point that it doesn't really make a great deal of difference to anybody, but the cost has gone up massively. You've also got this problem of political uncertainty, that on these kind of big long-term projects, if government changes its mind or voters have referendums and stuff, that can scupper the whole plan, so the financing is difficult. I think maybe we've got a specific problem in Britain as well, though, which is... lo and behold, rooted in our planning system and the way we just make it extremely difficult to build anything. And our friends at Britain Remade have talked about this. It was in the Foundations essay that Sam Bowman, Ben Southwood and Samuel Hughes put out a few weeks ago to much acclaim. But basically, it looks, when you look around the world, countries that have got nuclear right and can do it for a reasonable cost, kind of many times cheaper than we're capable of doing it in the UK, generally adopt a fleet approach where they will take a tried and tested design which has been used elsewhere, and they'll just say, let's build 5 of them. And you've got the design, it works, it's safe, off you go. You mentioned this to me beforehand for Sizewell C. Was it Sizewell or Hinkley?
Hinkley.
So we're reproducing a French design, I think, from Flamanville. But through regulation, through the planning system, we've required 7,000 alterations. Which make this whole thing take forever and cost a lot more than it needs to. And it basically makes the idea of cheap nuclear energy unviable in Britain. All right. We've wandered a long way from the closure of the last coal-fired power station. But I think that's an interesting topic. I think this is one of the things that's really risen up the agenda recently because of Ukraine stuff, the spike in gas prices and so on. But I think maybe we are learning that energy, cheap energy, abundant energy, clean energy too, is really essential to our economic performance.
Well, it's something that
we're going to have to grapple with.
Yeah, it's just a sector that you don't normally think about unless something goes wrong. Before then, energy is just somehow there.
All right. Well, let's move on to topic 2. Neither of you had the pleasure of being at Conservative Party conference this week, so it falls to me to outline the essentials. So, look, three points, I think. First of all, the reports you've read in the newspapers or heard on TV and radio are true. This was an oddly cheerful conference for a party that has just had an electoral hammering of historic proportions. Now, some unkind commentators have described the mood as delusional, and maybe, people reading too much into the fact that Keir Starmer and the Labour government have got off to a bit of a rocky start. I think there's something else to that, actually. I think the reason that people seem to be enjoying themselves so much at Conservative Party conference this year is because, there's no leader. There's no set policy platform at the moment. Actually, because the Conservatives just lost the election so badly, there weren't an awful lot of corporate lobbyists there pushing, sort of fairly boring policy propositions on fringe panels and so on. This was very much a political conference where activists were discussing ideas and discussing policies and talking about the future, and sometimes saying quite radical things you agree with, things you disagree with. And so that's the first thing. It shows that politics that is kind of managerial and bureaucratic can be desperately boring. Politics, which is about ideas, can be quite interesting and exciting for the people involved. Now, that doesn't necessarily translate into electoral success. Important to point that out. But this did have a very different character from previous party conferences of all varieties, actually, that I've been to in the past. But that leads into the second point, which is, I think there's a debate going on in the Conservative Party at the moment. You see it in the leadership election that's going on. I think you see it among the activists and the conversations they're having on the fringes of conference as well, which is about how radical does a Conservative Party have to be? And I mean radical in sort of the true sense of the word. How much should they be looking for deep underlying fundamentals that need to change, both about the political party, but also about British government that might enable them, A, to win and B, to succeed in future? I think you can probably put the leadership candidates on a bit of a spectrum of how radically they're thinking, how much they think, everything has to be torn up and you have to start from scratch, versus, actually, if we're a bit more likable and we're a bit more competent, people will vote for us again. The pendulum will swing. And I think this is my last point, leaping off from that sense of radicalism. But quite extraordinary that the Kemi Badenoch leadership campaign during conference published this pamphlet called Conservatism in Crisis, The Rise of the Bureaucratic Class. Now, I say extraordinary, A, because this really isn't the kind of thing that political campaigns tend to do. This is not a policy manifesto. It's quite an advanced conceptual document trying to identify and diagnose the root causes of malaise within a particular kind of political ideology, but also in the country as a whole. And it's I can't believe I'm saying this about a political document. It's actually worth reading. It's very interesting stuff. And the thesis, basically, is that we have this sort of self-reinforcing circle in British politics, but probably in Western politics in general, between a new progressive ideology, largely of safetyism, of protecting people from others and from themselves and reducing risk, and not being terribly concerned about individual freedom and so on, a sense that the bureaucrat knows best. So you have this ideology, these ideas, but then this is reinforced by a large and growing interest group whose sort of status, whose livelihoods doesn't depend on production of things people want to buy in the market. It depends on, in some sense, administering or responding to government rules. So there's obviously you've got your civil servants, you've probably got a lot of lawyers fall into this category, regulators, but people in the private sector too, human resources, risk management, and so on and so forth. Universities, the document suggests, are a big part of this as well. And there's a hint of that elite overproduction thesis, that we've had a massive explosion in both people coming out with undergraduate degrees, but also postgraduate degrees, and going into these fundamentally kind of non-market-driven careers. I don't know if I agree with all of this, but I think it's a very interesting attempt to stitch together the ideas side of politics and what's maybe going wrong intellectually, but also to identify a class of people who perhaps unwittingly benefit from the status quo and perpetuate and advance it. Kristian, I don't know if you've had a chance to look at this paper, at least in outline.
Only the summary.
Yeah.
Okay, clearly the Conservatives are trying to come to terms with the fact that they've been in power for 14 years, and Britain isn't in any meaningful sense a more conservative country now than it was in 2010. And they're trying to find an explanation for that. And this is true irrespective of which wing of conservatism you're looking at. I mean, that's one of the things. I didn't follow the coverage around the conference, but well before you could see that all the different wings of the Conservative Party and conservatives outside of the party seem to be unhappy with what's happened over the past 14 years. So the Thatcherites hate it because they say the state is larger than it's ever been. The NatCons, the National Conservatives, they hate it because they point to immigration figures and rampant wokery. The more centrist, technocratic ones hate it because they hate some of the populist rhetoric coming out of the party. So nobody is happy with it. And I guess this paper is one attempt to make sense of it. Why, if you have a conservative government for so long, why aren't they turning Britain into a more conservative country, irrespective almost of what exactly you mean by that? One danger with talking about whether you want to call it a bureaucratic class or blob or whatever is that you take away responsibility from politicians. That may not be the intention of the authors, but that is going to be the way that explanations like that will be interpreted. We already had this while they were still in power, that the reason why I've unfollowed most conservative politicians on Twitter is that when every time you saw them tweeting something, it was about them moaning about the blob doing this or wokery, this and that, acting as if they were the opposition in a country that's governed by Black Lives Matter and momentum.
Yeah.
And you can do things in government. There may well be a group of people who would put up resistance if you tried to, if say Kemi Badenoch was prime minister and if she tried to get her agenda through. I'm sure there would be institutional resistance at some point. It's just over the past 14 years. How many times did we even get to that stage where that mattered? Very rarely.
Yeah, I mean, it's so. I think there are two types of blob analysis that sort of fall into the categories of one, which is kind of as you're describing, which is excuse making. Basically saying, oh, well, we would have liked to do X, Y, Z, but we couldn't because the civil servants were acting against us and all that kind of thing. And I agree. I think that's useless and counterproductive and slightly pathetic. But
tell us what you really think.
Well, yeah. I mean, that could summarize the last 5 years of the Conservatives in power. It's just sort of floundering around for a purpose, not really finding one, and then trying to cast about for who to blame. But I think that is a kind of useful place for analysing the growth of different sectors in the economy, and how there are a lot, like some of the things in this publication, they are grounded in actual figures. So one of the very interesting ones is the expansion in the number of regulators to people working in the financial sector. So I think it increases from about one regulator for every 11,000 people in finance in 1979 to something like 1 in 75 today.
Nice.
And you also do definitely have this process of not just elite overproduction in the sense that more and more people are going to university, but it's also a demand side thing that more and more, particularly public sector jobs, which are now requiring university degrees. So in order to become a police officer, you now have to have a degree. In order to become a nurse, you now have to have a degree. And this sort of can sometimes create a particular sort of way of viewing the world, which might not be, particularly helpful to economically liberal arguments.
Yeah, I think the thing I find most interesting about this pamphlet, and I should say, I don't intend any implied endorsement of Kemi Badenoch in this. I don't, have a dog in the fight. But the thing I think is so interesting is that it tries to make concrete this previously very amorphous idea of the blob. We've heard a lot about the blob without actually anyone being specific about, well, who exactly is the blob? What is the blob trying to do? Why are they trying to do it? And why are they so successful? This seems to be an attempt to go beyond that, oh, well, the blob stopped us kind of idea, to actually saying, well, here are a set of interest groups, and here is their ideology, and here is the way that those two things reinforce each other and gradually take over more and more of the economy. And I think, in a way, the interesting one on financial services was, okay, so obviously that figure that they cite about the number of regulators to financial services workers is pretty striking. But I think there was also a figure in there, and I might forget the exact numbers, but it was something like, I think at Citigroup, they went from having 5% of their staff working in compliance to having like 15% of their staff working in compliance. And so if you think of that kind of growth of non-value generating staff within industries, well, maybe that has something to do with our productivity crisis. I mean, one small example, but if that's replicated, it could be quite profound. And as I say, I think that this is quite an interesting development, that a kind of prominent politician who is trying to achieve a kind of significant role in British public life is being so explicit about the kind of foundational thinking that's driving her agenda. You very rarely see this, whether it's because foundational thinking normally isn't there, or whether it's because people want to conceal it from the general public. This nonetheless seems to be something a bit different.
Yeah. And I think there's also a really interesting contrast. You sort of said you can array the Conservative leadership candidates on a spectrum on how fundamental they think the issue is. When so James Cleverly came in to, as you know, you interviewed him last week, or was it the
couple of weeks ago, maybe, yeah,
week before, and he quite pointedly sort of said that, well, I always found when I was a minister that if you give civil servants clear instructions and, follow up on that, they do pretty much what you say, and you're able to achieve things. pretty obviously hinting that some of the other candidates who complained about obstruction have just been bad ministers.
Yeah.
And it's an interesting sort of difference of approach there.
Maybe that's the real divide. People talk about it, well, he's from the left of the party, he's from the right of the party, one nation, Thatcherite. It's not really clear to me that those labels are very meaningful in this current contest. But perhaps that argument between we've just got to be better at government and people will vote for us again versus actually the British state is broken. It makes delivering a right-of-centre agenda practically impossible, so we need radical change. That perhaps is the debate that below the surface is going on. It'll be interesting to see
Well, you could
what
have
comes out of it.
You could have a bit of both. So there may well have been what there definitely was. This growth in regulators and all sorts of people who are involved in compliance and monitoring rather than producing stuff. But all of that has a legislative basis. So there is some kind of basis on which this happens. And whoever is in government, well, they have something to do with this. So the growth of the blob, bureaucratic class, whatever you want to call it, doesn't just happen on its own. It's not just a self-perpetuating bureaucratic class, but it is based on something over which, if you're in government, you have perhaps not perfect full control, but a meaningful degree of control. And I'd say for a party that has been in government for so long, any kind of analysis of what's wrong with Britain has to start with them. Just as Thatcher did in the 70s, where she didn't just attack Labour, but also started with an honest analysis of what went wrong with previous Conservative governments in the post-war period.
Absolutely. Maybe it would help if we talked about politicians as lawmakers rather than as policymakers, remind them that rather than complaining that the law is frustrating them in their efforts, they do have the power to change the law and reshape things the way they want to. All right, well, let's move on. Kristian, I went to Birmingham. You went to New Delhi.
Yes.
Did you get the better end of that agreement?
I definitely did, yes. So haven't heard much about the Conservative Party conference, but nonetheless, I'm convinced that I made the right choice. Yes, I went to the Big Lizard Man meeting, the Mont Pelerin Society, which I guess you could say is a sister organization of the Institute of Economic Affairs and, of course, founded by Hayek himself. Hayek was an indirect founding father of this institute. In their case, he was the literal founder. The basic idea initially was a similar one. It was about bringing together the few remaining classical liberals that were still there, people who would have had, well, a sense of professional isolation at the time. They probably thought if you were a liberal academic in the late 40s, of course, you would have felt everyone is against you. And the idea was create a forum where these people can get together, share ideas. So it's partly about actual collaboration on things where they would say present papers, talk to each other about research projects, but also that psychological sense of you're not the only one, you're not crazy. Classical liberalism is an actual thing, and we may be a minority, but it's not just you. And the Mont Pelerin Society is, I guess, to some sections of the more conspiratorial left, it is what the World Economic Forum is to the conspiratorial sections of the crank right. So in a way that some people on the crank right would go on about Klaus Schwab and the WEF. You have George Monbiot. I've read in one of his articles, he seems to think the Mont Pelerin Society basically runs the world, wrote something about how everything that's bad in the world today started in 1947 in a small village in Switzerland. And so the same sort of things that he writes about us, and this is that on an international scale. Where they differ from us massively is not in terms of ideology, MPS, IEA. It's more that they are a strange organization in the sense that they don't produce written output. So there's no such thing as an MPS book or an MPS paper or say something like this podcast. That alone is something that they would never do. They exist for the sole purpose of running this big conference once every 2 years, plus some smaller regional ones. And that is what they do. So if you go to their website, it's almost completely empty. It's really about this idea of just getting people together where they can freely exchange ideas, and it's supposed to be private. And the private part there, I can see why that, if you're a bit Monbiot-brained to begin with, I can see how that would trigger you, that you have these people organizing big conferences, and you can't see anywhere what actually happened there. But Eamon Butler wrote a book on their history for us 2 or 3 years ago, and he makes the important distinction. He says, yes, what they do is, it's not secret, it's private. And that is a distinction. It's a bit like if you told me something at a pub, which is maybe not meant for the whole world, and if I tweeted it later, I wouldn't be committing a crime, but you would probably think, well, it's bad form. You shouldn't do that. Yeah. But no, a great conference. I would absolutely recommend it. It really is full of liberal thinkers who have interesting things to say, and there's a lot of intellectual energy. I wish they had the kind of power that George Monbiot thinks they have, but it's a good place.
Yeah, and I mean, just to be clear, it's a very different crowd from the World Economic Forum. I mean, this is largely economists and other classical liberal academics who are coming together just to have quite high-level intellectual discussions about things. It's never seemed to me, from the outside at least, to be particularly focused even on policy development. It's much more of a high-level intellectual thing. And I do think the history of this organisation and its relationship to the IEA is kind of interesting, because you had that sense of the last remaining classical liberals, free marketeers coming together in the wake of the Second World War, consciously trying, I think, to develop a new liberalism, a kind of a new synthesis of all their different kinds of thinking. And probably out of that collaboration and other efforts, you got supply side economics emerging, you got the Chicago School and monetarism, you got public choice economics, you got so many of the ideas actually that we still base our work on today sort of were developed in that post-war period, maybe flourished over the 60s and the 1970s, and then fed into political change in the 1980s. I suppose the question and the challenge is that kind of intellectual development, an idea advancement happening now, or are we just looking backwards too much? I mean, Kristian, I'll ask this one to you, and Dan, you can come in on it, but I mean, do we need again that kind of very concerted effort to craft a new liberalism fit for the times, and which can kind of fight back against what someone at a Conservative Party conference called the zeitgeist of collectivism, gripping Britain and gripping the Western world?
Yeah, maybe a bit less dramatic than in the late 40s when you had half of Europe being Soviet occupied and still in the ruins. The reason why they did this in Switzerland, one of the few places that weren't bombed out at the time. So compared to that, we are in a less terrible place, but it's definitely that doesn't happen often. Yeah, but I will correct it. It's all relative. I guess if you had gone to an MPS meeting in the 90s, there would have been a greater sense of triumphalism, end of history feeling. That is clearly over. So the idea that we're all broadly liberals, that is clearly not true anymore. If it ever was, to the extent that it was true, at most there was a period in the 90s, early 2000s when you could reasonably say, okay, most people would, if only grudgingly in many cases, accept that there has to be some role for a market economy, some role for decentralized decision making. That's no longer true. Today, it very much does feel as if we're in the defensive, and in that sense, we absolutely have to get the remaining liberals together. And firstly, internally, for having this network building effect, and something that the MPS can't do, but we very much can, is to reach out and preach the word.
Yeah, I think probably one of the big advantages of these kind of meetings and the exchange of new ideas is it can kind of avoid the issue of politicians and policymakers simply sort of falling back on kind of like a kitschy, nostalgic version of like neoliberalism, whatever you want to call it, where you sort of get a notion that, economic liberalism was really successful and really important in the 1980s, and it dealt with lots of problems then. So we need to deal with the same problems in the same way when actually the world has changed in a lot of ways. So I think you've talked quite a few times about the idea of sort of naive laterism, where, you know, people sometimes will act as if, you know, simply, you know, any tax cut will essentially pay for itself, because when you cut income tax down from 83% to 60% on the top rate, it does seem to do that. Yeah. Well, you won't get the same effect if you're cutting it from 45% down to 40%. And I think that's going to be one of the really important things that people on the economic right do over the next few years, particularly in Britain, while the Conservatives are out of power, is like, what are the key problems we're facing today? And it's not primarily trade union militancy. It's not primarily the top rate of tax. It's other issues, some of which we've highlighted today, like the incredibly expensive energy. And I think one of the things the organizations like MPS, other bodies can work on is like actually trying to work out what we need to solve today and how we're going to go about solving it.
That's what this foundation's essay by Sam Bowman and his colleagues does. And what's interesting about it is that even though the authors are clearly economic liberals, but this isn't in itself an economic liberal agenda. So I could imagine, say, a French Gaullist agreeing with about 80% of it. But that's the interesting thing about today's issues, and specifically the ones for this country. It's much more about getting stuff built, doing stuff, ideally in a liberal way. But even if it isn't that, that's more important than the 1980s karaoke, where you would still, I think what happened in the 80s is simply that this issue of tax cuts became a bit sort of identity forming. That this is an overall tribal signifier. By saying I'm pro tax cuts, that's your way of saying I'm on this side of the spectrum, and it's an emblematic issue. Whereas in its own right, it no longer has the importance that it had in the 80s. We really are talking about different issues today, and that needs to be reflected in what we do.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'll put in a word for the continued importance of tax reform, but you're definitely right that it isn't the kind of definitional issue about getting growth up that perhaps it once was, alongside things like whipping inflation and dealing with trade union power. I think Hayek in his essay, I think it was Intellectuals and Socialism, talked about the need to really discover a sense of intellectual adventure around liberalism. That it had to be a little bit utopian, it had to be inspiring. Fundamentally, it had to be new and exciting if it was going to succeed. And that's obviously something that we hope we can do here at the IEA. Hopefully it's something that the Mont Pelerin Society will contribute to going forwards as well. Guys, thank you very much. Let's leave it there for now. I hope you've enjoyed this edition of the IEA podcast and will join us again in future. If you want to know more about our work, you can see our website at iea.org.uk or follow us on Substack at insider.iea.org.uk. Until next time, thanks for listening.